Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Noble and I'm a fantasy author. Welcome back to my Slavic Saturday series where we talk about Slavic mythology, history, and folklore related to my Slavic fantasy series called the Frostmarked Chronicles and the first book in the series, A Dagger in the Winds. This week on my Slavic Saturday series, we're talking about gods and goddesses again with a list of what could be considered two or a single goddess, depending on how you look at the regional differences. Regardless, it's a goddess of spring, and the name could be either Żywia or Vesna. Before I jump too far into Żywia and Vesna, though, I just want to remind you that I'm looking for advanced readers for A Dagger in the Winds, the first book in that Slavic fantasy series. Advanced readers receive a free ebook copy in the book in exchange for a review either on Amazon or your favorite retailer. Check out the links down in the description below to learn more. But now, let's jump into these goddesses. So many of the gods and goddesses that we've talked about on the Slavic Saturday series have been gods and goddesses that are worshipped usually across many tribes throughout Slavic territories. There's been some examples like Živana that are worshipped more on subsections of those tribes, but in general, many of the gods were worshipped across all of the tribes, or at least most of the tribes. There were also many gods in Slavic mythology that were worshipped by some tribes and not by others. And that's because of the massive amount of territory that the Slavic umbrella makes up. Even today, there are many countries across Eastern Europe that are Slavic and have incredible differences between them. And this is one example of that, with Żywia representing more northern Slavic culture, and particularly northwestern Slavic culture, and then Vesna representing much more Slavic culture, for two goddesses that are incredibly similar and fulfill almost the same role with slight differences between them that we'll go into. And the first of those roles was the role of springtime. This was a major event in most Slavic countries because, especially among the northern Slavs, the winter time was a very harsh period. And because of spring's significance, there are many gods that embody a different part of the spring period. Many of them are actually considered, depending on the story, potentially siblings of either Żywia or Vesna. And some of those are Živana or Divana, who is the goddess of the wilds and hunt, Jarilo, who is the god of the war, spring, and agriculture, as well as the sun god Dashbog, who's the god of the summer sun, versus Horus, who is the god of the winter sun. In this situation, and them being the siblings of both Jarilo and Živana, but not Dashbog, they would be also the sister of Marzana or Marzana, who is the goddess of winter and death, who we'll talk about a little bit later. This also makes them the daughters of Perun, who's the god of thunder, and potentially Makash, who is the great mother and the goddess of women in Slavic mythology. But due to a lack of writing among the early Slavs, plus a large variation among tribes, the stories also potentially say they could be the daughters of Svarog, who is potentially a smithing god, but also a creator god, and sometimes god of sky or fire, and then Lada, who is the goddess of love, who are also the parents of Perun and many of Veles potentially, and other gods, depending on what story you look at. And this is one of those points where Żywia and Vesna are kind of interchangeable, because while the gods varied by region, a lot of the time they fell into these same roles within the family of a lot of the Slavic gods. One difference, though, is the fact Żywia was sometimes considered the wife of Dashbog, who's that summer sun god, and Vesna, at least according to my research, never showed up holding that position. And also because of regional differences, these two goddesses are also often compared to the people who I mentioned as possibly their siblings, Živana and Jarilo. And this is because they are all spring gods. Jarilo focuses mainly on agriculture and war, but he is also a spring god. Živana focuses on the wilds and the hunt, but she is also a spring goddess. And sometimes people believe that these gods were interchangeable, or that they're different names, specifically Živana for Żywia and Vesna, that they may all be the same goddess, different names. I'm not necessarily certain about that. I think that there is some overlap. And that's why I brought Żywia and Vesna here together, because there's a lot of evidence for why the southern Slavs named her Vesna and the western Slavs named her Żywia. As spring goddesses, though, they tended to be the more softer ones. They represented the life, the bloom of spring through the meadows and the nature element of it, while Eurylo represented the more agricultural basis for spring, and Dživana represented the deep wilds and the animals of spring. There's a difference here, because the wilds were considered often a dangerous place to the early Slavs. They were often dark and distant away from their village, and bad things tended to happen if you go too far into them. While Żywia and Vesna represented more of the kind of close nature, it seemed, based on the friendly aspect of them and the positivity that they tended to bring with the beauty of spring and fertility of spring. And on the topic of them being fertility goddesses, there's a little bit of a difference here. While they both formed a potential similar role, Vesna seems to be a little bit of a younger figure here. Her other forms could be considered as things called Vesnas in Serbian and Croatian mythology that were often similar to Vilas that we talked before, which are kind of nymph or fairy that would sing and dance in the woods and often try to lure young men into the woods. So there seems to be this little joyful, fun element to her that can be similar to this idea of these fairies. Żywia, on the other hand, doesn't really have that. She has a little bit more of a maternal role, though Makosh tends to have the more great mother role in Slavic mythology. Żywia has this little bit more of a motherly element to her that the Vesna has the little more of a younger element to her, which kind of forms an interesting contrast between the two. So one of the most popular festivals among Slavic mythology is the drowning of Marzana, which came on the spring equinox, because it's the end of the winter, and Marzana's winter brought death. And like I mentioned before, Marzana was considered to be potentially the sister of Żywia or Vesna, and it was actually their job to carry out the killing of Marzana and send her to the underworld of Navia until next autumn. So while the tribes were celebrating this festival by building an effigy of Marzana and then burning and or drowning it either in Vesna's fire or Żywja's water, depending on how the attachment was. You can watch more about that festival in the video I'll have tagged up here, but the Żywia and Vesna's role in it was to actually carry out the killing of Marzana. And this was done by either of them, depending on the region, being carried by Strizbog or Stribog, who is the god of the winds. He would carry them to Marzana to do the kill. Eurylo was also with them often as well as a kind of protector against whatever Marzana threw at them. But Eurylo often wasn't considered able to make the kill himself, despite being Marzana's ex-husband. And the reasons for that are many. You can check out the video on Eurylo or Marzana that I'll tag up above for more details about both of them. And regardless of which role or region that they played, Żywia and Vesna would then slay Marzana and then bring spring with the bloom and nature that they're associated with, and this is often why they were praised for it. So when it comes to appearances, Vesna and Żywia again are very similar. They often are pictured with very long hair and flowing dresses, or sometimes wear nothing because they're fertility goddesses. But they were often wearing elements of nature or long white dresses, and they often were also pictured with birds or wreaths or flowers or apples or other things that would symbolize springtime. As fertility goddesses as well, they were pictured as the ideal women, which you can kind of assume what that would mean in the Slavic old context of that. And the only real difference I could find of appearance between Vesna and Żywia, again, was the kind of age-focused difference that I mentioned earlier. They were still both pictured often as younger women, but Żywia tended to have a little bit more of a maternal sense to her, while Vesna did not. And there was also the little bit of the hair change difference. Often the hair color for either could be black or blonde. Vesna has also been pictured with reddish hair, but that wasn't as common. So in my own stories, this was kind of an interesting aspect to work with in the Frostmarked Chronicles. The idea of having these different spring gods and the roles that they play. I decided, because there's not just the regional differences, but a little bit of a character difference, that I would bring this and a little bit increase the difference between them for my books. For there's many spring gods, and using each of them allows these elements to come through. With Żywia bringing out the life and the nice flowy nature of often water that is associated with spring. Vesna being a little much more vibrant nature, bringing through spring with fire and the burning of Marzana through that. And then this other spring gods that are Eurillo, with bringing the agricultural basis of spring, Żywia bringing the very wild basis of spring with the animals and the deep wilds, and then Dashbog bringing the sun and that warmth of spring. So there's all these elements that came with the cycles that exist in Slavic mythology, and I thought they would add into it. And that's all I have for you on the Slavic Saturday series. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe down below. You can also join my newsletter down below, where I give out free copies of novellas that were associated with the main Slavic fantasy series. And I'll be starting to give those out this year, so make sure you're on that list to be able to be the first ones to receive those books. But until then, I will talk to you guys next week.